Hi, I'm Phil DeBerry. I'm a retired minister in the Western North Carolina Conference, and ever since my wife and I retired in 2014, we have been participating here at Providence United Methodist Church. I'm here to talk to you about a story that comes to us from the first chapter of Luke. And I recommend that you read that first chapter of Luke. I'm not going to do that today because it's much too long. But it tells us the story of Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. It tells us also the story of the Annunciation to Mary and her response to that Annunciation, learning that she's going to carry the Messiah. And it tells us how Elizabeth and Mary rejoiced together when Elizabeth was visited by Mary. And it tells us what happened when the child was born not to Mary, but to Elizabeth. And we're going to get to that right now. So read the first chapter of the book of Luke, and then you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm an Agatha Christie fan. I'm presently reading one of her Hercule Poirot murder mysteries called Curtain. Early in the story, Poirot has just made a surprising statement to his friend Captain Hastings. And it's so surprising, in fact, that Hastings says, "I stared at him open-mouthed." Have you ever been dumbfounded? Has there ever been a time when you experienced something that left you speechless? Have you ever been so taken aback by something that someone said or did that you simply couldn't find the words to express your feelings? Has someone ever said or done something so outrageous that words failed you? If so, you've been dumbfounded. And the Gospel of Luke tells us about someone who was dumbfounded. Zechariah was a priest of the division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was descended from Aaron, Moses' brother. Both of them were righteous people who followed the commandments of God and lived by the law of Moses. But Elizabeth was barren. They had no children. They had been waiting and hoping for a child, but the waiting was so prolonged that their hope was becoming futile. Zechariah's division was on duty in the temple, and as was the custom in those days, the priests would call forth all of those priests who had been serving in the temple but had never had the opportunity to go into the sanctuary itself and to burn the incense on the altar. And so all of those names were put into a container and one was drawn out. And this particular day, it happened to be Zechariah's name. Now, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We say that sometimes, and we don't really mean once in a lifetime. But for Zechariah, it was, because once he had fulfilled those duties in the sanctuary, his name would never be put into the jar again. So Zechariah accepted this great honor and went into the sanctuary. He began to prepare the altar for the incense. And as he was doing that, suddenly an angel appeared on the right side of the altar. And as would be the case for most of us, Zechariah was startled. He was gripped with fear. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid. Your prayer has been heard. Elizabeth will bear you a son, whom you will name John. He will bring joy and delight, not just to you, but to many people. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit, and he will do great things to prepare the people for the coming of the Lord." Zechariah said, "How can I believe this? I'm an old man, and Elizabeth is an old woman. And the angel responded, I am Gabriel, and God has sent me to tell you this good news. Well, to paraphrase Captain Hastings, Zechariah stared at him open-mouthed. He was struck dumb. He could find no words to express his emotions, not to Gabriel or to the congregation waiting for him to emerge from the temple, and not to Elizabeth, who did indeed become pregnant. Let's think about this story. It begins by telling us that all of this happened in the days when Herod was the king of Judea. Now, Herod was the earthly power and authority. He was the puppet of the emperor in Rome. And so when the first readers heard that statement that it happened in the days of Herod, maybe they were thinking something important had come out of the royal palace, that there was an announcement by Herod or his officials. But no. God's mighty acts did not involve Herod. They involved a devout old couple instead. History would only remember Herod as the king who just happened to be king when John the Baptist and Jesus was born. But he wasn't even aware of the events for which he would become known to history. Zechariah is the one who is important in this story. His name means God has remembered. And that name is significant. Zechariah and Elizabeth have remembered the promises of God to the people of Israel, and they've lived their lives in accordance with those promises. They followed the commandments of God. But even though they've done that, it must seem to them that God has not remembered those promises. And so Zechariah and Elizabeth have grown dull in their expectations. And this means that they go through the motions of faithfulness without really having hope in the fulfillment of God's promises. This is evident in the actions and the statements of Zechariah. He prayed fervently to God, but he was not prepared for his prayers to be answered. He was chosen to perform the priestly duties inside the sanctuary itself, but he really didn't expect to encounter God's presence there. When the angel appeared to him and gave him the good news that he had brought, Zechariah asks Gabriel, "How will I know what you're telling me is true?" And even when he hears that God himself has sent the good news that he and Elizabeth will have a child, he had difficulty believing that. The news was so surprising, so unexpected, so shocking that Zechariah was dumbfounded. He had experienced a vision of the Lord, but he was unable to speak a single word about it. In Luke's gospel, following this episode in the temple, we move to the annunciation of the birth that was given to Mary by the angel Gabriel. And then we see the episode when Mary visited Elizabeth and both of them were pregnant. And because of the great news that both of them had received, Mary sang the wonderful song, the Magnificat. We're not going to talk about those two things. You read about them. But we are going to move to the end of the story in the first chapter of Luke that tells us about the time when the child was to be circumcised and named, the child John that was born to Elizabeth and to Zechariah. Those who were officiating were about to name him Zechariah after his father, but Elizabeth said, "No, he's to be called John." That was not a name that had ever been used in the family, and so to verify, the officiants turned to Zechariah, who still couldn't speak. He wrote on a tablet, "His name is John," and immediately he was able to speak again. And the first words out of his mouth were words of praise to God, who had fulfilled his promise to Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come and has redeemed his people." Zechariah's tepid hope and lackluster worship had been transformed into triumphant affirmation. By verifying what God had done for him personally, he was able to verify the redemption that God had already brought to all of his people. Now, the question that this story raises for us is this: are we prepared to affirm the redemption that God has already brought us? We say that the season of Advent is about preparation. Most of us say it's about preparing for the birth of the Christ child, as if that has never happened before. But Luke is telling us something different. The birth has already occurred. We have already been redeemed. Zechariah's story makes us stop and ask ourselves, are we prepared to acknowledge what God has already done? And are we prepared to live our lives with joyful and triumphant praise for the God who has already redeemed us?